In February 1943, Rommel's panzers are again on the attack in North Africa. This time, he's facing untested US troops in the mountains of Tunisia, but the clock is ticking. As his veterans batter their way through the Kasserine Pass, the British are steadily advancing behind him. The Desert Fox has a bold plan to defeat the Allies in Tunisia for good. Little does he know, however, it will be his last battle in the field, and will soon lead him to total defeat in what some later will call Tunisgrad. By late 1942, Axis forces in North Africa are on the back foot. After Rommel's decisive defeat at the Battle of El Alamein in November, British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army chases the newly renamed German-Italian Panzer Army back across the Libyan desert. Shortly afterwards, Anglo-American troops under General Dwight D. Eisenhower land in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. The goal for both the Axis and Allied armies is Tunisia, home to the last major Axis ports of Bizerte and Tunis. For Rommel, the shorter supply lines in Tunisia offer a chance to replenish his army and perhaps bring it closer to being an effective force. But 2,500 kilometers of non-stop retreat has unsettled the German High Command. In Berlin, the General Staff make arrangements for his replacement and continually ask Rommel to take much-needed sick leave. He refuses for the time being. Luckily for Rommel, Montgomery's pursuit is slow. By prioritizing fuel deliveries for the best German units, most panzer divisions are able to limp across the Tunisian border. Italian troops lacking vehicles are not so lucky, and the British take many of them prisoner. On January 23, 1943, the British captured Tripoli, while to the west, the British 1st Army, including the US 2nd Corps and French 19th Corps, approached from the Tunisian-Algerian border. Meanwhile, the Italian Navy and the Luftwaffe move reinforcements into Tunisia, some via the massive Messerschmitt 323 transport planes. There they join German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army. Together with Rommel's Panzer Army, the Axis have 104,000 German and 74,000 Italian troops by late January 1943. However, both panzer armies are under-equipped, and Rommel's force has lost 2/3 of its tanks and half-tracks and nearly all of its artillery on the retreat. However, around 800 Luftwaffe aircraft can provide local air superiority. Tunisia promises a different kind of North African combat than the open deserts of Libya. Here there are mountain ridges, narrow passes, and vast salt marshes, making maneuver and rapid advance difficult. Although cornered, the Axis troops still pose a threat to the spread-out Allies and prevent the rapid capture of the ports in late 1942. So Allied troops set up positions along the East Dorsal Mountains. Eisenhower requests permission to drive a wedge between von Arnim and Rommel, but his British colleagues think the plan is too ambitious and want to wait for Montgomery's arrival. British officers also have reservations about the inexperienced Americans. Many US officers have never seen combat, and major maneuvers in 1941 showed deficiencies in senior leadership, tactics, and infantry training. Although retraining corrected some issues, Eisenhower himself notes that some of his officers are complacent. Rommel has already dismissed US troops as, quote, Britain's Italians. The Axis wants to strike the Allies in the west before Montgomery's estimated arrival in the east in early March. Von Arnim's forces already had some success against US and French troops, and he's confident that he can deliver a serious blow in southern Tunisia. Once Rommel arrives, the Germans adopt a two-part plan. Operation Frühlingswind, Spring Breeze, will see Arnim's 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions strike against vulnerable US positions around Sidi Bouzid, a major supply base and headquarters of the US 1st Armored Combat Command A. Once von Arnim has pinned US forces there, Rommel's Panzerarmee will launch Operation Morgenluft, Morning Air, a rapid strike from Gabez to Gafsa and through US positions around Kasserine. But things are tense at German headquarters. Rommel and von Arnim don't like each other, and their animosity grows as they work together, which means overall commander Albert Kesselring has to intervene to smooth things over. The dual operations also have no definitive end. Instead, German commanders will quickly draw up extended plans based on the results. On February 14th, von Arnim launches Frühlingswind, with 2 armored columns breaking out of Faib. Supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers, the panzers take green US troops around Sidi Bouzid by surprise. Isolated on two hilltops, the US infantry is unable to move or support each other. With communications unreliable, Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Infantry Regiment sends a desperate report written on toilet paper. Enemy surrounds 2nd Battalion located on Mount Lesuda. Shelled, dive-bombed and tank attack. Germans have absolute superiority, ground and air. I'm attempting to hold my CP position. Unless help from air and armor comes immediately, infantry will lose immeasurably. But US forces are scattered around the region, and his commander, Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall, is over 100 kilometers away at Tebessa. On February 15th, Shermans and Stuarts of the 1st Armored Combat Command A attempt to counterattack the experienced German panzers, but the result is slaughter. Airburst artillery forces the US tank commanders into their turrets, reducing their visibility and speed. German Lieutenant Kurt Wolf recalls the results. Scarcely had the first shells left our guns than the first 3 enemy tanks were on fire. Soon, there were at least 15 burning tanks ahead of us, and the remaining enemy tanks had retreated. The battalion commander, laughing like a boy, went from company to company, asking us and himself too, "Did you ever see anything like that?" The panicked withdrawal turns into a rout, with US troops fleeing their positions. Meanwhile, Rommel's troops launch Operation Morgenluft, but find that their main target of Gafsa has already been abandoned. But instead of ruthlessly pursuing the fleeing Americans, the Axis units advance cautiously, giving US troops time to take up new positions on the western dorsal. Rommel, who was still overseeing the final elements of the Libyan evacuation, quickly relocates to take command of the next stage. The success of Frühlingswind and Morgenluft reinvigorates Rommel. He now develops an ambitious plan to surround Allied forces in western Tunisia. Rommel thinks if he gets command of all of von Arnim's armor, including heavy Tiger tanks, he can punch through Kasserine Pass and capture the US supply depot and headquarters at Tebessa. Once resupplied with captured fuel, he could then strike 225 kilometers to Bonn on the Algerian coast, encircling the entire Allied force. He eagerly sends the plan to Kesselring and the Italian Comando Supremo. But von Arnim is against the idea. Instead, he wants to keep his panzers for a conservative operation towards the British depot at Le Kef. Although unlikely to completely defeat the Allies in the west, this will cripple them for the foreseeable future, allowing a stronger defense against Montgomery once he arrives. The result, though, is a compromise. Rommel gets von Arnim's panzers, but must use them to strike towards Le Kef. Rommel's Operation Sturmflut is set for February 19th. 2 main columns would strike towards mountain passes at Kasserine and the Sbiba Gap, and Rommel would reinforce whichever thrust produced the most results. But Rommel wasn't happy with this compromise, as he wrote later. At other times, our higher authorities were so wildly over-optimistic that they hardly knew what to demand of us next. Now, however, when a little boldness really was required, they lacked the guts to give a wholehearted decision. Guarding Kasserine Pass is a weak US force under Colonel Alexander Stark. His cryptic orders from Fredendall reference a stubborn and costly last stand from the US Civil War. Go to Kasserine right away and pull a Stonewall Jackson. But Stark's men are mostly construction troops and have never seen action. They struggle to build a hasty defensive line. They do plant 3,000 mines, but simply lay many of these on the road. The Americans do have artillery support, including from a horse-drawn French battery of 75mm guns, but powerful Allied armor reserves stay at the rear to avoid a repeat of the Sidi Bouzid disaster. At first, Rommel tries to force the pass with a decisive strike through the valley, but artillery and machine guns push back the attackers. German commanders order panzer grenadiers to scale the heights either side of the pass and clear out US infantry. Both attacks start with some success, but a lack of air support and artillery means the Germans soon retire. Still, although the defense largely holds, Axis troops are slowly advancing. Fredendall even prepares to abandon his headquarters at Tebessa. Meanwhile, the German strike against Biba is going poorly. British and US anti-tank guns repel the attack, and Rommel decides to focus on Kasserine, including the newly arrived Nebelwerfer rocket artillery. Late on February 20th, US troops abandon their positions, leaving their armor unsupported. The French artillerymen, having fired all their ammunition, spike their guns and fall back too. There's now nothing to stop Rommel's panzers, which breach the pass and destroy a small British armored force that had been sent to block them. Now flushed with victory, Rommel splits his force in three and attacks towards Tebessa, Tala and Spiba simultaneously. But the Axis offensive is losing steam while fresh Allied troops with armor and artillery rush to the front. By splitting up his forces, Rommel has weakened their offensive punch. Although the Germans briefly reach Tala, Allied material superiority is turning the tide. By February 23rd, with clear skies bringing Allied air attacks, it's clear Le Kef is unreachable and Rommel calls off the attack. The Battle of Kasserine Pass can be seen as both a US and a German defeat. Although German troops forced the pass, the overall German plan failed quickly. US commanders are disappointed at their performance. Some accuse Fredendall of hunkering down in his bunker instead of issuing clear and decisive orders. Following Kasserine, he's replaced by General George Patton. Historian Robert Citino concludes. Although blaming the general is the most simplistic form of military history, it is occasionally hard to avoid. The evidence against Fredendall is overwhelming. Others have been more forgiving, suggesting Fredendall's failure is indicative of wider issues concerning rapidly turning a small peacetime army into a larger warfighting force, such as untested officers and tactics. Furthermore, considering their lack of experience, US troops performed relatively well against German veterans, even according to Rommel. Die Amerikaner hatten sich vorzüglich geschlagen. The Americans performed excellently. Rommel has also been criticized, especially his decision to split his force following Kasserine and expect rapid drives in mountainous terrain. Some historians suggest it is surprising, given his experience in the Alps in World War I, that Rommel didn't clear the heights before his armored push. But Rommel likely felt he didn't have the luxury of time, given Montgomery's 8th Army was closing in. Rommel's relationship with von Arnim impacted the operation too. Rommel was outraged to find out von Arnim only sent half the 10th Panzer Division and kept all the Tigers for himself. Von Arnim instead uses them in his own failed offensive on February 26th, losing 15 of his 19 Tigers. These are losses the Germans cannot afford. By March, they only received 29,000 of the required 140,000 tons of supplies. Meanwhile, the US alone bring in 400,000 tons. What's left of Rommel's forces will now be needed to face off against Montgomery in the east, and Rommel rapidly relocates to the Mareth Line to face his old opponent. Rommel doesn't like the new position, which consists of a series of pre-war French forts. But his superiors demand that he stops 8th Army outside of Tunisia. Hitler promises he'll send new weapons and reinforcements. But by now, Rommel only has 160 tanks, mostly Italian, against 800 tanks in 8th Army. Meanwhile, losses and fuel shortages mean the Luftwaffe has almost disappeared from the Tunisian sky. Rommel knows Montgomery is getting stronger, so he orders a spoiling attack to disrupt British preparations for March 6th. However, his subordinates attack in the south instead of along the coast, as Rommel had initially wanted. In any case, Montgomery's dug-in tanks and anti-tank guns, including powerful 17-pounders, are waiting for them. The silly buggers came right at us, didn't they? Some of us who were in the early desert fighting expected a Rommel flank attack, something clever. It never happened. They kept coming straight across the plain. Montgomery put it more succinctly. The Marshal has made a balls of it. Although only 94 Axis troops are killed, Rommel loses up to 56 tanks in what is his last action as a commander in North Africa. On March 9th, the Desert Fox finally agrees to take sick leave in Germany. Montgomery now launches his attack on March 16th. It will be a frontal charge supported by a wider flank, largely made up of New Zealand, Indian and French Senegalese soldiers. The frontal assault initially has some success, establishing a bridgehead across the Wadi Zigaou, but Allied troops soon lose the position with heavy casualties. Frustrated, Montgomery prioritizes the flanking maneuver. Indian troops use their mountain experience to move through rough terrain and attack from behind the Mareth Line, while the New Zealand Corps rush further to the Axis rear, breaking through Axis defences on March 26th. Rommel's replacement, General Giovanni Messe, falls back to the narrow Wadi Akarit position, but Allied forces overrun his lines by combined artillery bombardment, frontal charges, and mountain infiltration. The situation is now dire for the Axis troops. Hitler hopes that Tunis and Bizerte can become meat grinders to deplete Allied forces and delay a European invasion, but morale and equipment is lacking. By April, von Arnim's 5th Panzerarmee has 150,000 men and 150 tanks against 210,000 Allied troops and 1,200 tanks. Patton also regains US positions at Gafsa and Sened Station, eventually linking up with 8th Army on April 7th. Now 8th Army clashes against the new Axis positions at Enfidaville. Again, the first assaults fail, but mountain troops, including Gurkhas, backed up by accurate, concentrated artillery fire, break the position open. For every Axis artillery shell fired, the British fire up to 30. The US II Corps, now redeployed in the north under General Omar Bradley, also batter their way towards Bizerte with renewed confidence. Von Arnim sends an envoy to Berlin to plead for an evacuation, but Hitler refuses to see him. When Hitler finally allows the evacuation in late April, it's of little use, since the Axis lack air cover and shipping. On May 7, 1943, the Allies capture Bizerte and Tunis. On May 13th, Axis forces surrender, along with tens of thousands of their troops. Many are Italian non-combat and colonial troops, but many are also German veteran units, like the 15th and 21st Panzer and 90th Light Divisions, which surrender to a man. A contingent of the elite Hermann Göring division that fought in Tunisia is also captured, although a few do escape to Sicily. Almost immediately, Allied troops referred to the Tunisia campaign as Tunisgrad, a reference to the recent Soviet victory at Stalingrad. This is due not only to the tough nature of the fighting, but also the seemingly decisive nature of the victory and the number of prisoners taken. Tunisia was not an easy victory for the Allies, and the disasters at Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass tainted British perceptions of the Americans for some time. In total, the Allies suffered 70,000 casualties in Tunisia, with the US losing 2,715 dead, 9,000 wounded, and 6,500 missing or captured in its first major campaign in the Mediterranean theater. Of course, these numbers are not close to Soviet losses at Stalingrad, but they are a large portion of the roughly 240,000 Allied casualties for the whole North African theater since 1941. Axis losses in Tunisia are up to 62,200 with 12,200 killed, also far less than Stalingrad. Similar to Stalingrad though, the capture of Tunisia trapped and destroyed a large Axis force of over 250,000 men. Army Group Africa may not have been as central to Axis war plans as 6th Army at Stalingrad, but it was still a significant Axis investment in manpower and resources. Its defeat also eliminated tens of thousands of experienced troops as well as material that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. In fact, the Germans redirected transport planes earmarked for Stalingrad to Tunisia, meaning they couldn't supply either location properly. The Luftwaffe struggled to recover from the losses it suffered over Tunisia and the Mediterranean theater, which amounted to 41% of the entire air force. The victory was also total, since the Axis would never be able to return to Africa or even plan to. They would instead, from now on, move into a defensive posture concerned with the defense of their key territories. Meanwhile, Allied confidence grew, especially in Britain, after the disasters of 39 to 41. Despite the Kasserine defeat, Allied forces were starting to perfect an operational doctrine that combined high levels of mechanization with sophisticated logistics and thorough battle plans. This allowed them to effectively translate their advantage in industrial capacity onto the battlefield. Meanwhile, the victory showed the German way of war was faltering. German principles of Auftragstaktik or mission command, which emphasized autonomy and flexibility at lower levels of command, were coming unstuck against Allied material superiority and firepower. Such methods worked well early in the war against inexperienced and unprepared enemies, but the Allied method left little room for mistakes that the Axis could exploit. As historian Paddy Griffith concluded, German tactical analysts might growl resentfully that US tactics were inflexible, plodding, and all about material superiority, exactly like Montgomery's in effect, but the fact remained that the Germans could not win such a battle. The rest of the fateful year 1943 would only make this trend even clearer. Now that we covered Rommel's last battle of the Second World War, you might also be interested in Bernard Montgomery's last battle as well. In late 1945, the 21st Army Group under Montgomery had to cross the Rhine River north of the Ruhr region. The Battle of the Rhineland would be the last set-piece battle in the west, and the Battle of Berlin the last one in the east. Millions of Allied soldiers stood at the ready to bring the Third Reich to its knees, and the last German reserves would have to defend it. If you're curious about these two often overlooked battles of World War II, we produced two documentary series that together run for more than 8 hours. In Rhineland 45, we cover the battle for the Lower Rhine from the Reichswald at the Dutch-German border until the Allied crossing of the Rhine that involved the biggest single-day paratrooper landing of the entire war. In 16 days in Berlin, we document the entire 2-week Battle of Berlin day by day. Both documentary series were filmed on original location, feature expert guests like Ian from Forgotten Weapons or David Willey from the Tank Museum, and they show the Second World War in an uncompromising way that wouldn't be possible to show on YouTube. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45? On Nebula, a streaming service we built together with other creators. On Nebula, we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertiser guidelines, and the viewers there support us directly simply by watching our videos, which, by the way, are ad-free and usually uploaded earlier than on YouTube. If you head over to nebula.tv/thegreatwar and sign up, you can save 40% on an annual subscription right now and watch 16 Days in Berlin, Rhineland 45, or our brand new Nebula original series Red Atoms about the Soviet nuclear program. And that's not all. Apart from a growing number of Nebula originals, your subscription now also includes classes. In our newest class, I teach you everything about producing a real-time history documentary and give you a glimpse behind the curtains of our production methods. That's nebula.tv/thegreatwar for 40% off on annual subscriptions and supporting us at Real-Time History directly. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that is not making a balls of it, at least most of the time.